Good morning, folks. Welcome to That's My Farm. I'm Jim Schroyer, your host, and we're in luck because we're going to be speaking to Dr. Romulo Lalato, Kansas State University's Extension Wheat and Forage Specialist. A lot of things have been going on in wheat, and we're going to hear about it from Romulo in just a moment. We'll be back after these words from our sponsors.
Closed captioning brought to you by Ag Promo Source. Together we grow. Learn more at agpromosource.com.
That's My Farm is brought to you in part by Tallgrass Commodities. Big enough to serve, small enough to care.
Welcome back to That's My Farm. I'm Jim Schroyer, and with us we have Dr. Romulo Lalato, the Extension Wheat and Forage Specialist here at K-State. Romulo, thanks for taking time I gave you a head fake there. Sorry about that. Thanks for taking time. We've had a lot of things going on in wheat here the last week or so, and it started last fall, I guess. So kind of tell us a little bit about how the wheat crop's doing.
Definitely, Gene. Well, first, thanks for having me on the show here again. Always excited to be here with you, so thank you.
It's exciting, I know. Go ahead.
So an overview of the Kansas wheat crop so far, right? What have we experienced since the fall of 17 through now late April? And it always started back in the fall. If you remember, the first 10 days of October or so, we had anywhere as much as 7 inches of precipitation across the state of Kansas.
Right.
And that really delayed wheat planting for many producers. If we look back at USDA data, we can see that we were about 20% planted by early October, late September, early October. And then we have a gap there of about 15 days where the crop we didn't have any progress on crop planting. So when it was about October 15th, if you look back on that data, this year has been the slowest planting pace of wheat in the state of Kansas since 1994. So we were about 35% planted mid-October as compared to close to 70% historically.
Exactly.
So that crop was being planted late, right? And in addition to that, the weather conditions during the fall were actually below normal temperatures. So we were cooler than normal in the fall and during the spring as well. So the combination of that late planting and colder temperatures resulted in a crop that really didn't tiller much during the fall. There were many fields that we were seeing maybe one tiller, maybe two, but it was pretty rare to find more than 2 tillers.
Going into the winter.
Right. So we have several consequences that come with that. One of them is maybe we're less winter hardy. Going into the winter, we had a couple of freeze events, or actually very hard cold snaps during the winter, New Year's Eve and mid-January as well, where we were below zero and up to minus 10 or minus 15 there for several hours. So we were concerned with potential for winter kill at that part of the state, north central Kansas. In addition to that, many fields around the entire state didn't really have any precipitation since planting. So we had a late planting where we had enough moisture to get the season started, but really the lack of precipitation in the majority of the wheat growing season resulted in an early spring where the topsoil was extremely dry and there was subsoil moisture, probably 6-7 inches below the surface. There was subsoil moisture, but really dry topsoil.
We haven't had any moisture really to join the two zones.
Exactly. For especially parts in southwest Kansas, we didn't really have enough moisture up to now at least to join those two zones. In parts of south central Kansas, the central part of the state, where mid-March we got anywhere from 1 to 2 inches of precipitation, that definitely got the crop in better shape. Right. But in the southwest part of the state, things are looking really rough.
Yeah, I had a guy tell me the other day that it's been over 175 days since he's had any measurable precipitation, but he's out, it's not the end of the world, but you can sure see it from there, out in southwest Kansas. Romulo, we got to take a break. Folks, stay with us. We'll be right back after these words from our sponsors. See you in a minute.
To see this show and past episodes of Ag AM in Kansas, go online to agaminkansas.com.
Ag Promo Source is a unique group of marketing specialists with one mission: help your ag business grow. Each affiliate has their own area of expertise, and they work together to bring you advice, products, and services. To get started, visit agpromosource.com. Ag Promo Source. Together we grow.
The new Better Horses Network is worldwide. Presented by Lucas Oil. Featuring worldwide radio and TV with iconic hosts like Al Dunning, Sharon Camarillo, Ernie Rodina, Lindy Birch, and Craig Cameron. With American Cowboy, Horse and Rider, Brushy Creek, Cavenders, and Ride TV. Worldwide radio and TV. The all-new Better Horses Network.
That's My Farm is brought to you in part by Tallgrass Commodities. Big enough to serve, small enough to care.
Welcome back to That's My Farm. I'm Jim Schroyer. Romulo Lalato didn't run off during that break, and that's always good to have our guests stay during the break. Romulo, let's talk about fertility issues.
Sure, Jim. So one of the questions that I was getting quite a bit during this season is, well, we had such a drought extended around the entire state, and this was February, this was March, and producers were getting concerned because they could put their fertilizer, their nitrogen fertilizer on, but if it's not on the root zone, it's not going to be, if we don't have moisture to put the fertilizer in the root zone, it's not going to be uptaken by the crop. So the concern, one of the major concerns were how late can we go with that top dress application and still get a yield gain from that nitrogen fertilizer. So I guess to answer that question, we look back on some data that where from Oklahoma State, they were delaying nitrogen applications to the wheat crop. And they were seeing that going as late as close to jointing were still resulting in pretty good yield gains, even slightly later than that if there's moisture to put it in the root zone. Now, once we're delaying nitrogen applications past that first node and even close to that second node, most of the nitrogen is going to be geared towards protein determination of the crop rather than yield. So that, to answer that question, that's some of the research that we're looking at. Close to about jointing or so, we were still getting that yield gain. Now, very important factor there is that we can delay the nitrogen application, but we still need that precipitation to put it in the root zone so the crop can uptake it and still result in some yield gain. Another question that we were getting quite a bit was because of the last year's protein premiums that we were seeing, how to manage for yield and for protein as well.
Right.
So looking at these last 2 years data that we had in several trials that were looking at different nitrogen rates, it seems like we were needing anywhere, so for a yield level of about 70 bushels per acre, protein levels of about 12%. We were reaching that maximum yield across several locations in the state with roughly between what the soil was providing for nitrogen plus what we were putting in the crop, close to 150 pounds of N.
Yeah, that's important, what the soil provided and what a producer put on as well.
Definitely. That soil is very important to account for that nitrate in the profile because that can really account for the majority of the nitrogen that the wheat crop is going to use during the growing season.
Okay, so 150 pounds.
For that
12% and 70 bushels.
Exactly.
Okay.
So that puts us roughly at that 2.4 that is our recommendation for K-State. So it was good to double check that. Now for protein, we needed about 20 pounds more of nitrogen. So for us to reach that maximum protein, to really maximize protein.
Now is that 20 above the 150?
It is. Okay. We were maximizing protein at about 170.
Okay.
Now again, if the producer already had 70 or 100 in the soil, he would just need to complement that, right? So that's why it's very important for us to know how much nitrogen we have in the soil going in the growing season.
Okay. Well, I'm quite honestly, I'm a little concerned about protein levels on this crop because I'm hearing some things that producers haven't put on their nitrogen or they're just now doing it.
Definitely nitrogen is going to be one of the, management-wise, one of the primary factors affecting protein. If we're short on nitrogen, protein should be lower. But many times the environment is going to play even a bigger role, right? So if we have very warm conditions, like right now we have a late crop, there is a pretty high chance that we're going to have temperatures warm up during May, mid-May, and then
during grain fill, you're going to have higher temperatures.
Exactly, and that shuts down or decreases the amount of starch we're putting in the grain, increases that protein concentration.
Right.
So really, environment is one of the things that is very important, and nitrogen management as well.
We've got to take another break. Stay with us. Folks, you stay with us too. We'll be right back after these words from our sponsors.
Sure Crop Fertilizers was started by my father, Don Sherman, and my mother, Shirley Sherman. family business that started in the 80s. We predominantly focus on plant nutrients and what we can do to give growers better responses with the fertilizer dollars that they do, and what we can do to make those things work better for that grower. We're based out of Seneca, Kansas. We work with growers in their soil analysis to figure out what they need, and then we can put those in a blend that gives them the best results, and so that we can deliver that direct to their farm so that they have those nutrients where they need them, when they need them, and so that they can apply them in a manner that's very efficient to them and works well in their planting systems and what they're doing. Sure Crop Fertilizers has been around for a long time. We always say we're big enough to take care of everything you need, but we're small enough to do it quickly. You can get a hold of us at 1-800-635-4743. Our website is surecropfertilizers.com, and you can always email me at Corey@surecropfertilizers.com, and with any questions you have, we're glad to answer and work with you.
That's My Farm is brought to you in part by Tallgrass Commodities. Big enough to serve, small enough to care.
Welcome back to That's My Farm. I'm Jim Schroyer. Romulo Lalato, the Extension Wheat and Forage Specialist at K-State, is here with us. Let's talk about that freeze we had here some time ago, early April.
Yeah, Jim, definitely looking back in early April, we had some temperatures that were pretty concerning. In some of those events, temperatures got as low as 11 Fahrenheit or even lower than that, depending on where in the state. And at this time of the year, that's pretty concerning because that can cause some yield damage to our wheat crop. So looking back in early April, what the average stage of the wheat crop, stage of development of the wheat crop around Kansas was, because that's also very important for us to assess what's the potential freeze damage that we had. Mm-hmm. It really ranged, the earliest fields that we were listening about or seeing were about the jointing stage.
That was further south.
Further south, so Sumner County or even kind of Storrs, southeast Kansas. Mm-hmm. Those would be the earliest fields that we had back then in early April. And during that stage, the wheat can handle relatively well temperatures in the lower 20s, so maybe 22, 23 Fahrenheit there for a few hours. Now, colder than that, we have a chance to sustain some freeze damage. And before going a little bit further into that, what you look for on the wheat crop that might have been damaged, if we look back in the last 2 years or so, during the same time frame, so early April, there were fields that were reporting flag leaf emergence already. So that gives an idea of how late the crop was this year. Yeah. And that could have helped us in this freeze event, definitely, because if the crop was further along, it would have been much more sensitive, much more susceptible to that freeze injury.
I remember in 2007, it was Easter weekend in 2007 when we had some terrible cold temperatures, but the wheat, again, like you said, was further along in the flag leaf emergence stage. Yeah. So I just remember, stage of development wise is really, really important.
Definitely much more susceptible as that head moves along upper in the stem. Mm-hmm. Now, for the wheat that was jointed or less developed than that, what are some of the potential consequences that freeze might have? One of them is if the freeze is strong enough or cold enough for a long enough period, we could end up hurting some of those heads that were developing, that were adjoining, right? We could actually end up aborting some of those primary tillers.
Right.
If that happens, and there is enough moisture and nutrients, the crop might go ahead and release some secondary tillers or later tillers and try to compensate for that. But generally, the yield potential that is higher on those primary tillers will likely be reduced there.
Right.
So for us to know if that's happening, if we have still growth coming up, one of the first things that I would suggest looking for is the new growth, looking at the new leaves. If they are green and nice and healthy, that's a pretty good indication that the crop is still...
You mean the new leaf coming out of say, the older tiller?
Exactly, yes.
The leaves coming out, if they're green. But if they're yellow or chlorotic?
Then that's an indication of concern there. We might have actually...
That's a bad sign.
Exactly, might have lost the crop.
Or that tiller, anyway.
Or that tiller, yes, exactly. To go a little bit more in detail in each specific tiller, producers could or should split up some of those stems and look for that head, like for the color of the head and how turgid that head is. If the developing head is light green and nice, turgid, that's a pretty good sign that it's still alive.
Nice and firm.
Firm, yep. Now, if it is kind of white and mushy, that's a pretty bad sign as well. Indication that we probably lost that tiller. If the crop was further along, we could also probably look for split stems and other things like that. I don't think that freeze from early April actually would have done that because we didn't have much stem developing in the crop then.
Well, let's take a break right there, and we'll continue that thought process. Folks, we'll be right back after these words from our sponsors.
Valley Vet Supply is devoted to providing information and professional quality products at reasonable prices.
Valley Vet Supply.
Tarwater Farm and Home has been family owned and operated since its beginning in 1978. What you need for farm and agriculture, lawn and garden, clothing and footwear, and so much more. You'll be surprised at what you'll find in this huge store. They have what you need and lots of it. So come take a look. You'll discover that customer service is first and foremost. Always has been with the Tarwaters. Tarwater Farm and Home, 4107 North Topeka Boulevard.
That's My Farm is brought to you in part by Tallgrass Commodities. Big enough to serve, small enough to care.
Welcome back to That's My Farm. I'm Jim Schroyer. Romulo is still with us, and Romulo, we talked a little bit about the type of freeze injury from that early April. I know we always worry about freezes later in April and into May. What type of damage should producers be looking at with those kind of freezes?
So Jim, we talked about the critical temperatures for the wheat to suffer any freeze damage being close to 24, 23 at the early stages. As the wheat develops, it becomes more sensitive to low temperatures. So now, late April, if the wheat is already close to that antithesis, so between boot and or later than boot, heading through flowering there, it becomes much more sensitive. If we actually have temperatures about 32 or less than that, can already cause freeze damage to the crop.
Flowering, you bet you 32 will nail it.
Definitely, yeah. A boot may be slightly more tolerant than that, 28, 29 there, but it's still kind of borderline. So what are some of the symptoms that producers will be looking for in case we have some of these late spring freezes to the crop? Well, if the freeze happens during boot stage, it can happen that the head doesn't have strength enough to leave through that sheath, and then maybe it's going to come out from the sides of the wheat plant, right?
It gets trapped.
It gets trapped, exactly. So that's one of the symptoms that we see. We can also see some twisted heads and some parts of the head that are aborted, depending on when that freeze happened as well. So important for us to remember that, for example, wheat starts flowering slightly above the middle of the head and flowers up and down. So depending on when that freeze happened, it might actually kill some of those flowers in the middle or upper or lower portions of the head as well. Right. So those are all potential symptoms that we can see whenever that freeze happens later in April. And effects on wheat yield can be devastating depending on when it happens. We might actually see entire heads that are completely white or bleached later on, if that entire head got affected by the freeze. Or it can be minimal as well, depending on several factors, including how cold temperatures were, how long cold temperatures were sustained, position in the field. Many times, bottom parts of the field are going to be more exposed to that cold air. So higher wind speeds, for example, could decrease the wind chill and the actual feeling of that temperature in the field, potentially increasing freeze damage. On the other hand, if we have lower wind, colder temperatures can accumulate in the bottom parts of the field. So there are several things that play a role. Moisture in the soil as well. So many things that really affect the extent of that freeze damage to the wheat crop.
Right. Yeah, and like you said, you can have freeze damage lower on the stems that cause stem damage, and it causes the plant to eventually just cut off nutrients to the head as well.
Definitely. So if we have, for example, freeze damage to the stem, we might even split the stem open. Right. In some cases, we might see new tiller coming out of there and emerging. And if conditions are just optimal during the spring, as far as moisture and cooler temperatures, those late tillers can still produce some, but really the yield potential would already be much lower then.
Thank you. Folks, we'll be right back after these words.
KFRM is one of the largest farm radio stations in the nation, dedicated to informing and entertaining rural listeners from northern Oklahoma to southwestern Nebraska. You can catch KFRM in many ways. Of course, 550 on the AM dial, streaming at KFRM.com or on your smartphone by going to the TuneIn Radio app, or on Ag AM in Kansas on Tuesdays and Facebook every day of the week. KFRM, tune us in. You'll be glad you did.
About 6 jumps later, I was laying on the ground and thinking, boy, my shoulders sure hurt. I kept waiting, and it didn't get better and didn't get better. I'd heard about Kansas Regenerative Medicine Center on the radio. Got down there at 8 o'clock in the morning, and by 11:30 the procedure was all over, and it just kept getting better and better. And within 6 weeks, I was back digging post holes and doing the other hard work that I'd been doing before the accident. And I'm really pleased. It's really worked out well for me.
That's My Farm is brought to you in part by Tallgrass Commodities. Big enough to serve, small enough to care.
Welcome back to That's My Farm. Romulo Lalato is with us. And Romulo, in this last section here, let's talk about some other nutrients and fungicide applications, because we're getting close.
Sure, Jim. So some of the other nutrients that have been showing up across Kansas as deficient more often than not include sulfur and chloride. So deficiency of sulfur can be confounded with nitrogen deficiency as far as the leaves being kind of yellow and pale. But it's generally on the new growth as compared to the nitrogen, where you see the deficiency on the older growth. Deficiency of chloride, on the other hand, it kind of looks like many people confound it with tan spot. It's kind of a freckles on the leaves, like it's speckles.
Yeah, it looks like tan spot.
Exactly. So those are the two nutrient deficiencies that are becoming more and more common in Kansas. Now, those two nutrients, they're not very difficult to manage. The crop doesn't uptake a lot of either of those. So just to give an example, an 80 bushel wheat crop, when you're harvesting that, you're going to take out, as in the grain, 7 to 8 pounds of sulfur, for example. It's really not a lot. And you need another 15 pounds of sulfur in the straw. So 20 pounds of sulfur should be more than enough for 80 bushel wheat crop. Very similar levels with chloride as well. So it is generally an easy fix in that it's not very expensive to put the chloride or sulfur with a top dress nitrogen application, but deficiencies will typically reduce grain yield. Cropping systems or parts of the state where they are more often, that we see them more often, are if the wheat is following a soybean crop.
This is for sulfur.
For sulfur, exactly. Soybean removes quite a bit of sulfur, and so we tend to see sulfur chloride on those systems. Sandy soils, also quite a bit of sulfur deficiency. Important to remember, sulfur is a mobile nutrient, so if we have precipitation in excess as well, we can leach down the profile. So be on top of that, make sure that sulfur and chloride are taking care of your fertility. These are easy fixes, but they definitely can reduce grain yield as well if they're deficient.
Let's talk about fungicide applications.
Definitely, it is that time of the year. Once the flag leaf is out, if there is any potential for disease, so if the weather is conducive with moisture and temperature and the inoculum is there, so if we have reports from the south or even around us, planting a susceptible variety, we definitely should be on top of that fungicide application. Long-term research at K-State has shown about 10% yield gain from one fungicide application with flag leaf, and that can be greater if we're talking about susceptible varieties. These last 2 years, in average of several trials that we had around the state with and without fungicide across several varieties, some resistant varieties like SY Monument or LCS Chrome, they were really showing 3-4 bushels per acre yield increase. If we're talking about susceptible varieties, and again, these last 2 years where we had a huge inoculum of stripe rust in the state, we were seeing as much as 15 or more bushels per acre on those susceptible varieties. So whenever taking that fungicide decision, a few things to keep in mind are definitely, number one, what's your variety's resistance to either stripe rust or leaf rust? That would be the main diseases that are causing yield losses in Kansas. What's the pressure of that inoculum? Is it present in your field already or in neighboring fields, or is it just being reported south? So how close is that inoculum? And are the weather conditions conducive for the disease? Is it moist and temperatures are ideal, or are we dry and not hearing many reports?
Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.
Folks, thanks for being with us on this issue of That's My Farm. And don't forget, next Friday about this same time, we'll have another one for you. See you then.
Closed captioning brought to you by Ag Promo Source. Together we grow. Learn more at agpromosource.com.